Welcome, thanks for coming tonight. Those of you who are here of your own free will, and those of you who've had some encouragement from unnamed sources, we're glad to have you all here. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. This is our last lecture of the semester. But if you enjoy our programs, we have a printed schedule you can pick up on the way out for the spring semester. And if we have your emails, you'll be hearing from me about our future lectures and other things we're up to. But tonight we're pleased to have colleague Carol Graham back out to talk about an important subject. I think very important to literally everybody in this room. To use a cliche, it's the American dream. And hopefully that's why many of you are here at UNLV, and in terms of improving your shot at whatever you feel the American dream is. We'll talk about that tonight. Please be sure and shout out your questions and comments so we can all hear, and you can be immortalized on our recording, which will be up on our website in a few days of the lecture. Those of you who are note takers, don't hurt yourselves. We have Carol's PowerPoint already up on our website, so if you see some of her charts and data, you'll be able to refer back to it if you need to. Carol Graham's a senior fellow at Brookings and also a professor at University of Maryland. If you follow the national media on this topic of the American dream, happiness, inequality, you will both see and hear Carol speak about this. So we're happy to have her back tonight for the latest chapter in her work on this topic. Carol?
Thank you, Bill. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry to hear some of you were coerced. Hopefully, some of what I say will make you happy. Unfortunately, it's not all a happy story here. So I've been working for many years on well-being and outcomes in the economic, social, and health arenas all over the world. This particular talk is focused on the US, and in particular on mobility attitudes, people's beliefs that they can work hard and get ahead in the future, and their links to well-being, and why they're so divided across the rich and poor in this country, and why that's actually a threat to the American dream. So with no further ado, let me start. So the pursuit of happiness is in our Declaration of Independence, and it's not about guaranteed outcomes, but it's about opportunities to seek fulfilling lives. So Jefferson's idea of the pursuit of happiness was grounded in Aristotle and his concept of happiness as meaningful and fulfilling lives, and in John Stuart Mill, whose work combined ideas about individual freedom but also social justice. And all of this influenced Jefferson's thinking as he wrote about the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. I actually read about this. I read more about Jefferson than I ever thought I would to try and understand what he was thinking about when he talked about the American dream. But increasingly, as there's more and more discussion about how unequal a society we've become in the past couple of decades, I've been wondering the extent to which this American dream really is equally shared. Is the American dream and the right to the pursuit of happiness equally available to all citizens today? We know the U.S. is more unequal by any number of measures, but for decades, the U.S. also had exceptional attitudes about inequality, a high level of tolerance for inequality, with the idea being it was a sign of opportunity. Everybody could get ahead. If you worked hard, you could meet the American dream. You could rise up the income ladder. And so Americans were incredibly tolerant of inequality and didn't vote for taxation, didn't even bother really reading or caring about inequality. Attention to inequality has now increased significantly, and so one question is, are U.S. attitudes about inequality and opportunity still exceptional? And despite not only being something interesting to know, it turns out that people's attitudes about their opportunities and their future actually affect their individual choices and behaviors and their own investments in their future. So if the increasingly unequal distribution of opportunity means that disadvantaged cohorts of society are more likely to focus on the short term because they don't have faith in the future at the expense of investments in their own and their children's future, what does that imply for U.S. society? So I'd like to give you some insights into all of this from a new science of well-being measurement that I've been involved in. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining the approach, the measurement approach, and some of our main findings, and then turn over directly to the inequality of opportunity topic. So until about 5 years ago, I was one of a very small number of seemingly crazy economists using happiness surveys to answer a host of questions. And I certainly was the only economist working on developing economies at the time in this area. And we really were considered to be sort of loopy outliers, nuts. Economists working with psychologists using survey data, what are you thinking? But a lot of things happened in 5 or so years. Danny Kahneman, who was one of the psychologists we were involved in, won the Nobel Prize in Economics, first psychologist to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. Behavioral economics sort of took off. And we just did enough work, enough other academics started working with these surveys and showing that they really, one, that they were robust, and two, that we could answer all kinds of interesting questions, that all of a sudden happiness economics went from being out there seen as crazy in economics to becoming pretty mainstream. There are thousands of articles a year in mainstream economic journals now with happiness in the title. So the academic approach got some traction. And today the study of well-being has gone from being an entire new approach in the social sciences, entailing collaboration between economists, psychologists, medical doctors, and geneticists, among others. So it's a really exciting area to be involved in. I can't believe where it's gotten, but it really, we really have sort of almost a new branch of the social sciences. But equally remarkable is the interest in the policy community today. There have been some small experiments like that of remote Bhutan. Some of you have probably heard about gross national happiness. It's not really that. It doesn't replace GNP, even though that's what the popular myth about it is. But more importantly, other non-remote countries like Great Britain have now implemented well-being metrics in their national statistics. And the UN has called for happiness or well-being to be a focus of the Millennium Development Goals. And the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is sort of the organization of the major economies in the world, has also issued guidelines for statistics offices around the world so that we can collect these statistics the same way, avoiding errors in sort of best practice in this collection, in a way that eventually it'll be able to have well-being metrics complement the data that's in GNP and compared across countries from countries around the world. So these metrics don't replace income data or GDP data, but they do give us new insights, often into age-old policy questions. And they help explain why individual behavior so often departs from standard economic models in which humans are assumed to be hyper-rational utility maximizers, right? But we all know they're not. Instead, these metrics help us understand Homo sapiens, real human behavior. So the big departure in all of this is that we actually listen to what people say in surveys. In other words, we ask people about their well-being and we use that as real information. Standard or traditional economic model says you can only believe the data that's in revealed consumption choices because there's no consequence to what people say. People can say anything, right? And there's no consequence, so that's not real data. Well, it turns out consumption choices are often perverse, irrational. People may consume because they're addicted to things. They may consume to keep up with the Joneses, or they may just, they do, a lot of the behavioral literature has shown that people do really silly things, like they'll drive, 20 miles and spend $10 in gas to save 5 cents on a roll of toilet paper. So not all consumption data is really that great data. It works for some things and not for others. So with this approach, we can answer questions as diverse as the effect of commuting time on well-being, why cigarette taxes make smokers happier. Believe it or not, they do. There's a really well-done study in Canada that showed that smokers that lived in states with higher taxes were actually happier, controlling for everything else. The reason being, if you think about smoking not as an optimal maximizing choice, but if you think about it as an addiction or self-control problem, then taxes could help smokers quit. Why the unemployed are less unhappy with higher unemployment rates? It turns out, you would think, if you were unemployed and you have more unemployment around you, it would make you less happy because your probability of being reemployed is lower, and that's what a standard economic model would tell you. Turns out, this is shown over and over again, including in some of my own work, that if unemployed people are actually happier when local unemployment rates are higher because there are more unemployed people like them, there's less stigma, maybe there are more buddies to play backgammon with, but it helps us understand some of what's going on. We also find that, contrary to what economics would predict, people of the same income level are less happy when they're living in wealthier neighborhoods. So you take two people, they have the exact same income, say $50,000 a year. And the one that lives in a wealthier neighborhood is going to be less happy than the one that lives in a poorer neighborhood. Sounds crazy, right? Wealthy neighborhoods should be nicer. But if you're the same income level, you feel like you have less than all your other neighbors, some sort of comparison effects kick in, and people are less happy. So this is information that you can't really just act on, but it helps you understand a lot of perverse economic behaviors. And the method is particularly well suited for answering questions that revealed preferences don't answer very well. Situations where individuals don't have the agency or the capacity to make choices, and or when consumption decisions are not the result of optimal choices. So I work a lot in two particular areas. One is macro and institutional arrangements individuals can't change, like inequality. So think of a poor peasant in Bolivia, for example, who's made unhappy or not by inequality. We have no way of knowing, because short of emigrating or protesting, there's no way to reveal a preference, right? You just live with it. But with this approach, we can figure out if inequality does or doesn't make them unhappy. Or else when behaviors are driven by strong norms, addiction, or self-control problems. I mentioned the smoking example, but think about strong norms. Think about a person in a lower caste in India who doesn't send their child to school. Is that really an optimal, utility maximizing choice? Or is that the result of a very strong norm that sort of said, you're in a lower caste, your child's going to be in a lower caste? So that makes, you have a very different attitude about schooling. Again, that behavior may make that person unhappy, but we can't tell by just observing the choice. So we can answer all sorts of questions with this approach. What do we know? What are some of the main findings before I turn to the inequality of opportunity topic? Well, first of all, this is something that got a lot of the economics interest in happiness started. It is something called the Easterlin paradox. Richard Easterlin was the first modern economist to study happiness. He started in the mid-70s. He's still alive and kicking and is wonderful. He's the really, really nice and very active 85-year-old. But when he started this, he found what was a seeming paradox. When he was looking at countries over time and finding that even though they were growing very rapidly, average levels of national happiness didn't increase. So Japan quintupled its income in 3 decades, and average national happiness fell. The US grew at a very rapid clip, faster than any of the OECD countries until 2001, and average happiness levels were just flat, no change at all. Right, so this really shook up economics, because you're supposed to have sort of an increase in utility with increases in income. And then he found across, when he looked across countries at any one point in time, there wasn't a real relationship between per capita income and happiness. So here is a chart, and we could argue the whole rest of the time, although we won't, about whether or not there is an Easterlin paradox from looking at this chart. Because if you look here, the wealthier countries are on average happier than the poorest countries, right? So you'd say there's no Easterlin paradox. This is per capita GDP adjusted, and this is percent above neutral per country on a life satisfaction question. So you could say there isn't an Easterlin paradox. But if you look at the wealthy countries, there's no real pattern among them. And the poor countries are all over the map. And actually, Easterlin mispredicted this, because I actually put the developing countries in, and he only worked on wealthy countries. And he thought the relationship would be much more linear between income and happiness for the developing countries because people had less money. It turns out they're all over the map. So what's going on? Well, average per capita GDP is picking up a lot of unobservable things that vary across countries that matter a lot to people's well-being in addition to income. So democracy, for example. Freedom, that's very important to well-being. Public health, health in general. Public goods, environment. And there are big differences across developing countries in these things, because now at poorer levels of income, people can actually get, good public health, democracy, all kinds of things. So the Latin American countries in general are way above what their income levels would predict they'd be in happiness, because there's good quality of life, pretty cheerful societies, family ties, democracy, decent public health. And I'm from Peru, so this always makes me happy. And then down here, you've got countries, Iraq, Pakistan, Tanzania, and Belarus. Just not great places to live. Conflict, no freedom, and that shows up in the data. Then you have another issue when you're doing these averages across countries. Everybody loves to know where their country ranks, but they're actually very imprecise because you're not controlling for cultural differences in the way people answer surveys. So if you look here, France always scores lower than its income levels would predict. And my grandmother was from Paris, and I learned very quickly as a kid, don't run into Parisian coffee shops and say, you know, have a nice day, can I have a croissant? They'll look at you like you're certified nuts. Sort of a dour way of being. And then I had a friend from England who got so tired of being told to have a nice day when she went around the US that she started saying, thank you, I have other plans. So the point being that there are just cultural differences in the way people address each other, and that affects the way they answer surveys. And when we do these cross-country comparisons, we're picking up a lot of that, and we're not controlling for it well. But when we look at the individual level, we find some real consistencies that hold across hundreds of thousands of people across countries and over time. So this is the relationship between happiness and age, and it will make you happy or sad depending where you are in this, on here. This is years of age, this is level of happiness, and it turns out that there is a U-shaped curve. Now this is the pure effect of aging. We're controlling for all the other things like health and things that change as people age. But if you just isolate the effect of aging, there's a low point that's around the mid-40s for the US, Europe, a little bit later for Latin America, where this chart is from. And then for Russia, it's about 50, which is also life expectancy for males. So that's not a good story. But really, this holds all over the world. And I've done this I most recently did a study in Mongolia and another one in China, and sort of showed this again. And it turns out there are other sort of biological metrics that also support this. A colleague of mine from England, Andrew Oswald, did a study of apes, really, cheerfulness in apes, which was published in Science. So it was pretty well done. But he showed that they also had a U-curve, right? And middle-age crisis sort of thing. And then some of his work and some of mine shows that sort of not so much mental illness, but antidepressant use, things like that, actually have a reverse U, and it goes up right there at the top at the same place. So what explains this? Well, it turns out, if you think about it, middle-aged years can have double burdens: teenage kids, dependent parents, a lot of financial burdens. There's also an aspirations aligning with reality effect. So if by your mid-40s, if you haven't figured out that you're not going to be a rock star if you can't read music, maybe you should, right? Then there are other things. As people age, psychologists have found, a woman called Laura Carstensen has done very good work on this, they're emotionally much more stable. So it's kind of maybe it's wisdom, who knows. In economic terms, I describe it as the standard deviation of emotional experiences being much higher for young people. When you're young and you have a bad experience, it's the end of the world, right? You haven't had that much experience with bad experiences, so something bad happens and everything's going to be, it's terrible. And as you get older, you've had so many bad experiences, they just kind of roll off your back. Finally, there's selection bias because happier people live longer. So as you get up here, there are just less unhappy people in the sample. And lastly, our oldest respondent here was 99, and there could be a senility effect, but I will leave that to you. If you want to know more about the age curve, the cover of the Atlantic Monthly this month just came out with a whole article on this, written by my colleague Jonathan Rausch at Brookings, and it uses my data and a bunch of others. It's actually a really cool article. So what else do we know? What are the standard patterns? Because once we establish kind of the things that we know are consistent across people everywhere in the world, then we can control we can explore the well-being effects of things that vary. So showed you age. Income. Within countries, income matters. Everywhere we study happiness or well-being, poor people are less happy than people with enough means. After, what's enough? Enough varies across societies. After a certain level of income, it gets more complicated. People start to compare their incomes with others and other things. But being destitute is terrible for well-being. Health is more important than income. It's one of the most important things to well-being, and there's two-way causality, because not only are healthier people happier, but happier people are healthier. Employment is incredibly important to well-being. Everywhere we've studied it, well-being, unemployed people are significantly less happy than employed people, and it turns out long-term unemployment spells are things that people never adapt back from. So people are very good about experiencing some sort of adversity and returning to their kind of natural levels of well-being, but long-term unemployment is absolutely terrible for your well-being, and it has scarring effects. It lasts a long time. Marriage. We always find in these studies that married people are happier than non-married people, so everybody concludes, oh, marriage is good for happiness. But it turns out, in a way, it's an artifact of construction, because you're comparing in a one-time survey people who've married each other to unmarried people. And it turns out that happier people are more likely to marry each other, right? Who wants to marry a curmudgeon, right? So the overtime effects of marriage last about a year, and then both people return to their original levels of well-being. But when you compare them to the less happy people in the sample, then it looks like married people are happier. A colleague of mine in France did a great paper called "You Can't Be Happier Than Your Wife," and she showed, using overtime data, that the probability of divorce was highest in marriages where there were asymmetries in happiness levels. So the worst kind of marriage is where you have a happy person married to an unhappy person because they drive each other crazy. Friendships also work the same way. In other words, people who have friends are happier, and happier people are more likely to have friends. But there's also some work that shows that there are sort of positive additional effects from socialization, people who socialize or join social activities, or people who are altruistic also. So lots going on in the social arena. Okay, so how do we do this? And don't worry about the equations, but there are just a couple of important points on this slide that is before we turn to the other stuff so you understand what we're doing. We do these with large-scale data sets, hundreds of thousands of people, and observations on all their socioeconomic and other traits. So we look at the well-being, depends which definition we use, and I'll get into that in a second, of an individual at a point in time. And then we control for their demographic and socioeconomic traits, and they have very stable patterns. And then we have sort of an error turn that picks up what we can observe. A lot of happiness is genetic and unexplained. And then we can explore the happiness effects of things that vary or change more, such as do inflation or unemployment affect happiness or well-being more? Environmental quality, personal behaviors, smoking, exercising, commuting time, much more. Once we've got that top pattern established, we can explore the well-being effects of almost anything you want. The important point, though, is that we're not asking people if these things make you happy. We're not running around saying, does smoking make you unhappy, or do you like your commuting time? They don't even know we're looking at those things. Their reported well-being questions are the first in the survey, and then we add all this other data, and we compare variance across individuals who commute more or less time, or who smoke more or less, or who run more or less. And Bill Antholis, my Brookings colleague, is here, and running does make you happy, actually. Okay, so despite all the public focus on happiness, we make really clear distinctions between several well-being dimensions, and actually almost steer away from the term happiness because it's not that well defined. There's a chapter in my most recent book called "Should We Have Bentham or Aristotle in the Statistics Office?" And that's because there's broad agreement among scholars on two clear and distinct dimensions of well-being. So one is Benthamite. Jeremy Bentham thought of happiness as maximizing the contentment and pleasure of the greatest number of individuals as they experience their lives. This is what we call hedonic or experienced well-being. And then Aristotle thought of happiness as eudaimonia, and that's a Greek word that combines two terms, eu meaning well-being or abundance, welfare, and daimon meaning the control of an individual's destiny. And this falls under the rubric of evaluative well-being, which implicitly includes the opportunity to lead a purposeful or meaningful life. And that's what underlies Jefferson's concept of the American dream. And that is what, as you will see, is becoming increasingly unequally shared in the US. So hedonic metrics are better for assessing quality of life at the moment. Evaluative well-being is better for assessing people's capacities to make choices and to lead fulfilling lives. So how do we measure this? The hedonic metrics are they're trying to capture people's mental states as they go through their daily experience. We measure this very simply. They're very complicated measures that psychologists have used following people all day as they do things. But it turns out that these day after questions that we now use capture the same thing. And they're very simple questions, yes or no questions. Did you smile how often yesterday? Yes or no. Were you worried often yesterday? Yes or no. Were you anxious yesterday? Were you happy yesterday? And they track incredibly well with people's mental states. And then evaluative metrics are trying to capture people's attitudes about their life as a whole, and that includes their ability to lead meaningful and purposeful lives. And we measure those with life satisfaction questions, generally speaking. How satisfied are you with your life on a 0 to 10 scale? It turns out that people who are more positive about their future and their future mobility have higher life satisfaction scores, and vice versa. There's sort of a virtuous circle there. And these attitudes, positive about the future, higher levels of well-being, are linked to more willingness to invest in future and future outcomes. And we've documented this through a wide body of research. People with more limited future opportunities and lower levels of well-being have higher discount rates. The non-economic explanation of that is they have less capacity to make investments in the future and less confidence that those investments will pay off. So it's much more difficult to sort of put aside resources for the future if you don't really believe in your future and you have less resources at the same time. So we find that respondents with different future outlooks emphasize one or more or the other well-being dimension more. So people with limited capacities, such as people in deep poverty, tend to focus on the hedonic dimension of well-being because daily experience is pretty overwhelming. Daily experience is a struggle. So it's very hard to plan for the future, right, if you're just trying to get through the day. So they focus on daily happiness, religion, friendships, much more than people with longer-term outcomes. People with more capabilities and opportunities may focus more on these longer-term dimensions, even at the expense of daily quality of life in the short term. And anybody who's been a graduate student understands that, right? It's delayed gratification because you're investing in your own future and what you think will be a better future because of those investments. A part of this story is that people can adapt to all kinds of circumstances, and adaptations are coping mechanisms, right? They help you with adversity, but it's much easier to adapt to unpleasant certainty, even sort of deep poverty, and emphasize the day-to-day than to adapt to uncertainty, even that associated with progress. So I find a lot of progress paradoxes. My frustrated achievers are people with lots of upward mobility that report to be unhappy. There's a paradox of unhappy growth where we find controlling for levels of GDP. Respondents in countries that are growing very rapidly are less happy than the average. So if you think about China, China's had an explosion, a huge reduction in poverty, growth rates of up to 10% for almost a decade. At the same time that China's growth has been going like that, life satisfaction has plummeted. And it's all about change and the uncertainty associated with change. And here is a great adaptation story coming back to the US. This is the Dow Jones Industrial Average and average levels of happiness during the financial crisis. We have daily data from the Gallup organization, 1,000 people interviewed a day. And this is about when Lehman Brothers collapsed. The blue line is the Dow, and the red line are average levels of happiness. So what happens when the markets plummet? Average levels of happiness fell by 11% in 6 months in the US. Think that they didn't change at all for 3 decades of rapid growth, and in 6 months they plummeted by 11%. This is a huge drop. And there are a couple spikes. That's Obama's inauguration day, and this is Valentine's Day. How about that? But other than that, what happens? When the bottom stopped falling out of the markets, and some of you may remember this.
Which also appears to be Valentine's Day.
What?
Which also appears to be Valentine's Day.
Yeah, there you go. Very close, right? But at this point, the uncertainty stopped. Right? People had lost a lot in the markets, but this feeling of how much will I lose? Will I lose my house? Will I lose my retirement funds? That went away. And all of a sudden, people adapt, and average happiness levels go up higher than they were before. It seems kooky, but these same people say their economic situation is worse. So the point is people can adapt much better to uncertainty. And progress, and certainly crisis, is bad for well-being, but change is unsettling. So it helps you understand why some cohorts can get caught in really bad equilibrium. Okay, so to inequality. There's been a tremendous amount of new attention to inequality and mobility issues in the United States in the past couple of years. I think the financial crisis had something to do with it. And just a great example of this is all the attention that's been given to a book called Capital in the 21st Century, written by a French economist. It's 800 pages based on technical tax data, and it's a bestseller. It's on the New York Times bestseller list. Now, I would argue it's the least read bestseller ever. Even economists who have that book have not read through the whole thing, right? But it highlighted, what the book did is I think it hit a public moment, and it highlighted the extent to which the current trends and patterns in economic growth in wealthy countries are increasingly rewarding the very top of the income distribution. And the distance between the top and the rest is growing larger and larger. He predicts it's going to sort of grow exponentially. Not everybody agrees with him. But the point is his book has captured sort of disproportionate amounts of attention given the book, even though it's a good book. And it's hit a nerve, right? So do we still have exceptionalism in US attitudes about inequality given all this? Well, the answer is not really. In fact, this exceptional American dream attitudes seem to have eroded quite a lot. So when people in the US are asked whether inequality has increased and or whether the economic system is fair to most, 61% of Americans think it favors the wealthy versus 35% think it's fair. That falls in between the UK, who's slightly worse than us, and Australia, that's slightly better than us. More important, in my view, 62% of Americans think their children will be worse off than they are. Only 33% think their children will do better than they. It compares all right to many OECD countries, a lot of them still stuck in the Euro crisis. But in Latin America, a region long known for high levels of inequality, only 13% of Chileans and 38% of Argentines, who are the regional pessimists, think that their children will be worse off than they will. So people in Latin America are much more optimistic about their children doing better than we are. And the percent of Americans who think that people can get ahead if they work hard has fallen in the past decade, from 68 to 60%. So there's clear signs that this dream is eroding. Another example of two Americas, divided Americas. There was a recent study by David Leonhardt, a New York Times economics reporter, and he did it's based on a Google search, a Google word search, and he looked at the words that were common in difficult places to live and the words that were common in easy places to live. The difficult places were bad cities like Detroit. Easy places were Seattle, Northwest Washington. And what he found is that the common words in poor America are guns, religion, hell, antichrist, diabetes, video games, and fad diets. Not too optimistic, but more importantly, really living in the moment, right? The common words in wealthy America are iPads, foam rollers, baby joggers, baby Bjorns, and exotic travel destinations like Machu Picchu. Completely different. Investing in the future, right? Investing in exercise, investing in your kids' knowledge, traveling, learning the world. And I recently saw something else that was quite remarkable. Over half of households in the bottom income quintile, so the poorest quintile in the United States, over half of households don't have access to internet in their home. If you can imagine how much is done, how much business is conducted, how much information is relayed by the internet, how much we take it for granted, that's a lot of people who are sort of cut off in a major way. So what do we know? This really is new research, so a lot of it, I welcome comments, a lot of it is incomplete, but it's the trends I've found so far are pretty striking. Using data from the Gallup, the US Gallup survey that I used for the Dow Jones thing, and then also the Gallup World Poll, which interviews about 1,000 people per country per year in 162 countries. And we have data from 2005 to 2013. There's extensive data in both these surveys on sociodemographics and income, all kinds of attitudes and well-being dimensions. And what we did is we compared well-being metrics and attitude about future mobility in the United States with Latin America, a region that's long known for exceptionally high rates of inequality. Although it's important to note, the last decade in Latin America has been good. There's been tremendous poverty reduction, and even inequality has fallen in some countries. And we do simple averages, we did some regression analysis, and then the last thing we did is we did something called quantile regressions, which is what we're exploring how people's attitudes vary depending where they are, not in the income distribution, but in the well-being distribution. So well-being is distributed like a bell curve across people. There's some people, outliers at the top, the very happy people. There are outliers at the bottom, the very unhappy people. And it turns out they behave a little differently, and this also affects their attitudes. So what do we find? This is stress. As I mentioned before, people for whom daily life is a struggle, who are under a lot of stress, have a lot of difficulty planning for the future, investing in the future, because they're just getting through, right? Well, this is the poorest income quintile in the US, and this is the richest. And this is Latin America versus the US. As you can see, Americans experience more stress on a daily basis than Latin Americans. But the more important point is the gap between the stress experienced by the poor and the rich in the United States. The poor experience a lot more stress here, is twice at least the size of the gap between poor and rich respondents in Latin America, right? And this is the unequal continent, supposedly. Why is that? Many reasons. I think one reason may be that poverty, I think, is more persistent here and maybe more of a stigma. It's something we're trying to explore better. We're also exploring good and bad stress, because there's some stress that's associated with, just trying to get ahead. And we're also going to explore across different cohorts, age, race, all kinds of stuff. This is another marker. This is a marker of positive affect, positive moods, enjoying your day, which is how often did you smile yesterday? Well, Latin Americans also smile more than Americans. But again, you get a bigger difference between the poor and the rich in the US in smiling than you do in Latin America. So even smiling is unequally distributed here, which is not great. This is life satisfaction, and here the US on average scores higher because it's a wealthier, much wealthier country than Latin America as a region. And this is a life satisfaction, the best possible life question that actually is more framed and picks up a relationship with income more. And the difference between the poor and the rich here between the US and Latin America is roughly equal. This is the marker that I find the most worrisome. This is a question that says hard work will get you ahead in the future, yes or no. Okay? It's a question that works very well for capturing people's attitudes about their future mobility. And here we find that Latin Americans, there's very little difference between how the poor and the rich answer this question, right? The poor are almost as likely as the rich to believe hard work will get them ahead. Versus in the US, you get a huge division. So the poor in the United States are significantly less likely to believe that hard work will get them ahead than the poor in Latin America. The rich in the US are significantly more likely to believe that hard work will get them ahead than the rich in Latin America, or anybody in Latin America. And there's there's a lot of work that shows that people's attitudes sometimes are sort of not only a self-fulfilling prophecy, but also sort of justify where they are, right? So if you're rich, you want to believe that it's all because you worked very hard, right? And there's some sort of political debate in which some political cohorts like to say, well, the poor are poor because they don't work hard. And you get a certain self-fulfilling and I think quite a destructive attitudes cycle with that. But this is a pretty striking finding. We looked a little more closely at the determinants of this. What determines whether you believe hard work gets you ahead or not. There's an age effect, and guess what? It's an inverse. It's a U, just like the happiness curve, right? So the low point for the US is 50, the low point for Latin America is 49. So younger people are less likely to believe that hard work will get them ahead than old people, which is not a great story. The big difference here is that in the US, income matters tremendously to whether or not you believe hard work will get you ahead. Wealthy people believe it will, and poor people don't. In Latin America, there's no income difference. So again, that highlights the other chart, but tries to break it down a little more. And then we did these findings on the well-being quintiles, right? So are people's attitudes different across where they are in the well-being distribution? And what we find here is that this is the unhappiest quintile, and then Q90 is the happiest quintile, right? What we find is that if you are unhappy, believing in hard work getting you ahead, believing in the American dream actually has a positive boost, right? So it's good for the well-being of unhappy. In other words, people who are unhappy but still believe in the American dream are slightly happier than the other unhappy people. And there really isn't any effect for the already happy tend to be happy regardless. They care least about income, they care most about learning and creativity. But if you look at Latin America, you don't get any difference at all. Sort of regardless of how happy or unhappy you are, it's pretty much the same effect. Believing in hard work is a positive thing. So, two kinds of conclusions. One on this To America story. One is that we have stark evidence of major differences in well-being and attitudes about the future between poor and rich Americans. We have a wealthy group with high levels of life satisfaction and corresponding ability to plan for, invest in the future and in their children's future, and they do a lot for their children's future. And we have a poor group with much lower levels of life satisfaction, higher levels of stress, living in the moment, and much less optimistic about the future. And the gaps between the well-being scores of the poor and the rich, as you saw, are the highest for the mobility attitudes, belief that hard work gets people ahead. Right? That's the underlying sort of belief underlying the American dream, and it's very unequally shared. More positive, perhaps, I'm not completely sure how to explain this yet, is the story that belief in hard work seems to mediate the unhappiness of the least happy. So maybe continuing to believe in the American dream provides some solace for respondents who do. But we also know that individuals with higher levels of well-being have better future outcomes in productivity, in health, in social behaviors, either because of intrinsic motivation or because of their capacity to have longer time horizons, or both. If the current patterns in attitudes also translate into behavioral outcomes, and there's a lot of work done by some colleagues at Brookings like Belle Sawhill and Richard Reeves that see some of this in the social mobility patterns, then the gaps between the lives of the rich and the poor are only going to grow larger. So that really isn't a very positive story, so I'm not going to end with that. How can we keep track of this? And maybe keeping track of it better will help us address the problem better. So how do we keep track of Jefferson's dream? Including these metrics in our statistics would allow us to track quality of daily lives and people's opportunities and capacities to lead fulfilling lives, and how that varied across people and cohorts, individuals, cohorts. And it would also allow us to compare how we're doing with other countries around the world that are already including these metrics. Most scholars involved, serious scholars, are adamantly opposed to using just one happiness indicator, and I include myself in that, because if you just have one happiness indicator, everybody wants a ranking and they want to compare their country, but then you're mixing and matching things. You're mixing different well-being dimensions. You get to sort of a meaningless average that picks up a lot of these country-level unobservables that I talked about. What we could do, as the British have done and the OECD is recommending, is to just include 4 questions in our statistics that would complement GDP data, and these questions take about 2 seconds each to answer, so you're not talking about an expensive enterprise. General life satisfaction, then a positive and negative experience well-being question, say smiling yesterday and worried yesterday. The reason for that is life satisfaction goes from 0 to 11, and we know that it's a unidimensional scale, right? You have low life satisfaction or high life satisfaction, but you can't put worried yesterday on the bottom end of the scale and happy yesterday on the other, because positive and negative emotions they're not a continuum of each other, and you can be angry and happy in the same day. So you have to measure them separately. And then the Brits have also added an explicit question about eudaimonia, asking people, do they have meaning or purpose in life? And we've been using this question to see how it works, and it tracks very well. What's most remarkable, I was on a National Academies panel where we were asked to recommend which well-being metrics we should put into the US statistics, and we were very, very cautious because our statistical system is so complex and we're so politically divided. But we just met with a committee on national statistics, which are the heads of all the national surveys, and we had all these statisticians all excited, and they were telling us we were too cautious. So who knows, maybe you'll be seeing some of these metrics in our official data sometime soon. Lastly, just a couple of unanswered, but I think quite important questions, important not just for measurement, but for policy. One is cardinality versus ordinality, and that sounds very sort of nerdy and noinky, but it's important. When these surveys are not cardinal in nature, so you ask somebody to place themselves on a life satisfaction scale that runs from 1 to 10. Well, we know 10 is better than 1, but we can't assume 10 is 10 times 1, or 8 is 2 times 4, because there's no cardinal value. People are just putting themselves in categories, right? But if we were thinking about policy, we need to have some sort of weights on these things. We need to, do we care more, for example, about reducing misery, getting people who are at 1s and 2s up to at least somewhat happy than we do about getting, the already happy to being very happy? And, should we have thresholds? I mean, that's a discussion that can be had. We just haven't had it. Related to that, what's a meaningful change in well-being? Do we know? How do we translate this for the public? So I know that moving national average life satisfaction from 6.5 to 7.2 on a 10-point scale is a big change. But if you just said that, you put that in the front page of the newspaper, most people wouldn't know if that was good or bad or didn't mean anything, right? If somebody tells you the national unemployment rate went up by 1% last month, you know that's a bad thing. You couldn't tell me how many, I bet, at least the average Joe couldn't, maybe some of you can, but the average Joe could not say how many people actually became unemployed by that move, right? They just know, because they've been hearing that statistic for a while, that it's a bad thing. Turns out it's not that many people, because you're talking about 1% of the unemployed pool. But it's still a significant and meaningful change from policy terms, right? And for people's lives terms. So I think part of all this is educating people about how these metrics work and what is and what isn't a meaningful change. So lots more to do there, but we're making some progress. Certainly measuring well-being is more complicated, and well-being is a more complicated concept than is income. We know with income measures pretty much what we're doing, how we compare people of different income levels with clarity. But you also have to remember it took us years to get GNP right, or GDP right. And there was a lot of argument about what should go in, what should be measured, what should be taken out, and there's still adjustments all the time. So the fact that we're just getting these metrics right is maybe not all that surprising. And in my view, I think including them in our statistics would help us keep track of the American dream, and I think it's desperately in need of that. So I'm happy to answer questions. Back there? Yeah.
Sort of as a preface, have you read Charles Murray's work on inequality, particularly coming apart?
Yes, I in fact was on a panel with him 3 days ago at Brookings.
Oh, great. Well, so I had two questions. One is if you could just maybe comment a little on his work and what you think of it. But two, specifically, he talks a lot about his theory that there's a great divergence in American culture between the haves and the have-nots. And I was wondering if your statistic about the collapse of American exceptionalist attitudes might be explained by his argument that what you're really seeing is a complete collapse among the American lower class while the American upper class remains relatively unchanged.
I agree with the last statement that you're seeing a collapse of attitudes at the bottom of the distribution among the poor, and sort of a persistent belief in the American dream among the rich. But Murray also says, it's all about culture, and you can't find businesses can't find people that work hard. They can't hire people that are willing to work hard. Well, why is that? If people are disadvantaged before they get anywhere near the labor market, whether it's because of divided households, lack of education, lack of access to decent health care, whatever it might be, you have cohorts of people that don't get a chance to even form hard work attitudes, or they may not have role models, whatever it is. He's sort of saying it's all because people aren't willing to work hard. And I think the causes of that, if that really is true, which I question, have a lot more to do with what's going on with our health system, our education system, and all kinds of differences that poor kids face from day one versus rich kids. So, there aren't very many wealthy children that don't go to preschool. Well, there are many, many poor children that don't. That's already a tick against where you'll go. If you're born into a household of a single-headed household, again, you're disadvantaged from day one. There are a number of these markers that characterize poor households and poor households that stay in the bottom quintile. that get, I would say, that get well beyond just cultural differences that Murray raises. But you know, he's thought a lot about this stuff, and he's hard to argue with. Anybody else?
What are the trends between commute times and happiness?
Commuting time is the least happy time of the day for most people. So it depends. That's mediated by if you commute with somebody, it's less unhappy. If you use public transport, it's different. But if you're just alone in traffic, it's awful. And I guess that should resonate here since there isn't too much public transport. If you bike, I think it's a different story. Or skateboard.
Holding all factors constant, what is education and intelligence effect on happiness and well-being?
I don't think we've ever been as bold as to measure intelligence, but education correlates so closely with income that you don't always get a significant effect of education alone, and it varies. So in some places, say the transition economies, former communist countries, often you'll even get a negative effect on education because you're already controlling for income, so for the people that have done well. And then you have a lot of people with high levels of education, but that were educated in a different economic structure and they can't use their education well, right, to get up. So they've sort of, their frustration effects. But for the most part, education, at least some education correlates positively with well-being. Whoa, now I've got a lot of questions and I'm right there. Yeah.
Like if the American dream wasn't so emphasized in our culture, like, do you think the differences in attitudes of social mobility would be less dramatic, like similar to Latin America?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I think they're much, I think they're just much bigger, there's a much bigger divide in the way the poor and the rich live. Here, I think poverty is more persistent. And I would almost think it would work the other way, right? Because we've in Latin America, it was always, inequality was seen as a sign of persistent advantage for the rich and persistent disadvantage for the poor. So if that's the case, why are the poor so, why do they believe so strongly that hard work will get them ahead? There's something else going on. Back there?
I know we touched on it a little bit, but is there an actual study on having children and that effect on happiness of people who don't?
Yeah, the children thing is always an issue because there are several studies that find different things. The basic story is that there really isn't much difference in the well-being of people with children and people without children, which I have 3 beautiful children and I can't get around that finding. But I think what it is it, again, a bit like the marriage thing, you're comparing people who've chosen to have children and people who've chosen not to, for the most part. I mean, there are some people that are unable to have children if they want them, but for the most part in these big surveys. And then there are some differences. Typically, when people have children in contexts where they have sufficient means and having children is a choice rather than sort of an imposed norm, you get some positive effect in some dimensions of well-being. So you'll typically find that you get like a positive hedonic effect and then more stress, as most people with children can relate to. But in places where families are particularly large and often sort of a result of you don't really have a choice, you just have a lot of kids, then you often get no well-being effect at all, sometimes a negative effect. Is that probably?
Anyone with a last question? Sure.
You mentioned how in Google searches from higher and lower classes, you tend to have much more religious terminology with the lower classes. But my understanding is that most surveys indicate that religious observance, for instance, church attendance, tends to be fairly well correlated with income and perceptions of happiness.
Right. Well, correlated with income, I don't know. It's certainly correlated with perceptions of happiness. We did a study of religion around the world and well-being, and we found that for poor people, the channel by which religion was a positive effect was sort of safety nets, family, friends, something you can rely on. For less social people, the channel was socializing. So for very social people, that it sort of didn't matter, at least in that channel. But for less social people, going to church provided them like a social outlet. And for the wealthiest people, religion was sort of a social purpose channel. But the other thing we did is we tried to tease out causality, because I think actually happier people are more likely to be religious. You don't know which way the causality runs. And it turns out the happiest people are also the most religious people. So you can't say that you don't know which way it runs. The other thing we find is religion is not a positive factor in places that are very divided, where religion is a divisive force and sort of the source of conflict. And then the positive religion effect goes away.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you
Thanks,
for all your
Phil.
attention, your great questions. If you have a... If you have a question you didn't want to ask, we'll be around for a few minutes. I don't have a lecture to promote next week, but check your calendars. We have a great series coming up in the spring. We'll be talking about everything from climate change to the powers of the American presidency, which couldn't have happened at a better time, right? To health issues, to other social and economic policy issues. So hope we see you back soon.